Well, in my 25 years of being a professional amateur mountain biker, I've come across a fair share of people walking out of trails, fixing bikes at the bike shop, and spending a lot of money when they could have just saved themselves a lot of aggravation by just checking their bolts. Today, we're gonna be putting those years of experience to use and sharing with you some tips that will hopefully save you a few bucks and prevent you a long, aggravating walk out from a trail. Let's dig in. So one thing I gotta say right off the bat, whether you stick around for the whole video or not, I wanna get this one point in front of you guys, and that is if you feel something or hear something, stop and pull over. The topics that we're gonna discuss today are going to be the headset and front end. We will get into some suspension linkage as well. I'm gonna get into bottom bracket creaks and noise, as well as drivetrain grinding, crunchy, loud sounds. And any other sort of like vibrations, chirping, or rattling sounds that we can hopefully diagnose in a kind of what if scenario. Now again, this is coming from like 25 years of experience, a couple hundred bikes that I've ridden, and just the most common things I see and have had happen to me and my riding partners over the years. So first up, we're gonna start with the headset and general front end. I think that loose headsets are probably one of the most common things that we've seen and hear people asking about on the trail. Obviously, before we get to knowing what we need to check, we need to try to diagnose what's going on and then isolate where it's coming from. You're gonna need a multi-tool. We'll get to that, whether you've got at-home tools or something on the trail. We'll link a couple that we really like down below, but a general multi-purpose bike-specific multi-tool, because again, most everything on bikes is metric or Torx bits. But to isolate if you've got a loose headset, what I like to do is grab that front brake. Sometimes you can kind of get the feeling if you go like this, and if you hear a knock or feel something, grab that front brake, put your fingers around the top of that headset cup where the frame is, and simply with that front brake locked, rock the frame back and forth. Sometimes you can also do it to the side there to get a little different load. And if you feel play in here, you'll feel the shift and movement. That means you've got a loose headset. Very common, it happens a lot. So what you're gonna do then is you're gonna loosen the two side bolts, the cinch bolts on your stem. From there, you will then take your Allen wrench and tighten the top cap, or the Allen wrench that's here in the top cap. It is basically threading into a star-fangled nut that's inside the fork steer tube. You wanna snug that up because that's preloading the bearings that are here inside the frame. You do not wanna go crazy and over tighten it because you can strip that star-fangled nut inside the steer tube, and that's not a place you wanna be. It's better to have it come loose again and need to tighten it more than the other way around, especially when you're out in the wilderness. So snug that thing up pretty tight. What I like to do is kind of bounce the front end a little bit, make sure that the bearings have set, everything is seated. Snug it up again, make sure you're good to go. You want everything to be turning and steering freely. After that, align your stem and then snug up your stem bolts. And that's what's going to keep the stem cinched and tight on that steer tube so it doesn't rattle and slide its way loose once again. If you are still feeling front end movement and your head tube is tight, the next thing, right, you're gonna wanna just work your way down the system, right? The whole bike is a system and you want it all to feel tight. So what you could do then is, much like you check your head tube, put your fingers here around the seals where the fork stanchion goes into the lower on both sides. Do that same brake lock rocking motion to the side, kind of tap it a little bit, and you might feel that there's play in those bushings. Not a super likely thing to happen, especially on higher end forks, unless you've got super high miles. Nevertheless, it's worth checking as you're working your way down, right? Next up, obviously you've got your axle to worry about. You want to make sure that your axle is tight, that there's not any play in the hub. So give the wheel a wiggle side to side, make sure everything feels snug and tight in there. There's no play in the hub. Then you're gonna check that axle, make sure that it is in there tight. Again, not over tight. You don't wanna bind the lowers or put too much preload on those bearings, but snugged up. Your final thing to check is going to be the brake calipers and brake pads. So that's where locking that brake again. moving the bike back and forth. Some brakes, especially like Shimano's, they will always have a little bit of movement in that brake caliper pad like interface. So you could feel just a little bit of rocking in there, and that's pretty normal. But if you see the entire, caliper or brake mount, anything like that moving, if you see the rotor moving, bad news. You want to check that out and tighten it. Speaking of tightening your brake calipers, rub is another issue. So nothing, dead silent, that's good. If you hear rattling, rubbing, whatever, something I like to do is just tap the rotor all the way around, spin the wheel a little bit, tap it again. If you hear any loose rattling, if it sounds like a cymbal on a drum set, something's probably loose there. So check those torque bolts or the Torx bolts around the center of that rotor, make sure that's snugged up. So front end's tight, you're looking good. Now let's try to move a little bit farther back on the bike and see what's going on. So as I said, you don't have to be an expert to feel like something is off on your bike, right? We regularly have that feeling on the trail. Sometimes it's us and our body and brains, and sometimes it's the bike. So if you've isolated the front end and known that that is all good to go, the next spot that I would suggest checking is going to be all of your linkage bolts, shock hardware. We'll get into the rear linkage bolts and the rear axle as well. Some really good ways to check that are to kind of, again, you're gonna wanna grab the bike while it's parked. You can just lift up on the seat gently. If you can feel a little bit of knocking or see some loose movement or play every time you lift up and let it down, like you don't even have to pull it, just a finger and get it to unweight. And you'll see usually like the rear DU bushings in the shock could have been a culprit, right? Especially on older bikes. And from there, you can start putting your finger on places. If you do feel that there's some play or movement, put your finger here, lift, feels good, all right. Put your finger here, no movement. Then start checking here, every spot that you can, right? Every frame's different than, what we're using here with this Fezzari LaSalle Peak, but every bike's going to have, every dual suspension bike's gonna have linkage, shock mounting hardware, etc. So just play with those, lift the bike up and down, and try to feel where that is. While you're there and you've got the tool out, never hurts to just check everything manually, just snug it up, and then you got peace of mind knowing it's good. So we were just getting B-roll here. Lo and behold, I went to go fake turning the derailleur, and I got about a quarter turn out of that thing. So goes to show you, check those SRAM derailleurs and check them often. Chain lube, it's not expensive, use it. Whether it's wet or dry, doesn't matter. Some have pros and cons, but just use chain lube, bottom line. So after that, single speed, or I should say single ring mountain bike drivetrains are usually pretty quiet as long as the chain is lubed and your derailleur is adjusted properly, your derailleur hanger's in line. We've made a video on that topic, we'll link it below. If you've got an older 2 or even 3 sprocket drivetrain system and you're getting a lot of grinding noise, you may want to examine what gears you're in. If you're cross chaining, right, that means that your chain is rubbing on the inside guides or outside guides of that front derailleur. So, be mindful you're not in the small up front and the small in the back, right? Because your chain's gonna be super inefficient and creating a lot of wear, but it's also gonna be rubbing on that front guide and creating noise. So lube, make sure everything's straight and in alignment here. We'll link to that video, but for the most part, drivetrain shouldn't be making a whole lot of noise as long as your chain length's right and everything else is set up. Bottom brackets can creak and make a lot of noise, absolutely. We spent a lot of time cleaning, fixing, greasing, installing bottom brackets. One thing I will say is it's not always the bottom bracket if you've got a creaky bike. I remember one time there was a client that came into the shop 4 times to get his bottom bracket serviced, replaced, went through the whole bike because every time he'd get out of the saddle and pedal, it was creaking. And on the 4th time, I happened to walk in there and pull his water bottle cage bolts out. And he loved using like a really sticky, sugary drink mix. I pulled those bolts out and they were pretty rusty and dry and gross. And I put some lube, some grease, I should say, on those 2 water bottle cage bolts, put it back in. The creak went away instantly. So moral of the story is It's not always the big stuff, the most expensive stuff, the crazy things. Sometimes it could be some weird little thing that'll save you a lot of aggravation, time, and money. So again, bolt checks, grease, I know seat rails, right? And this hardware up here in the seat post, if you hear stuff, just get on and wrench on that seat back and forth with your hands. See if you can get that flex side to side, fore and aft. And if you can hear creaking, then you know it's the seat, right? It's not the frame or your bottom bracket when you're pedaling. Similarly, grease the threads on your pedals. If you ride clipless pedals, occasionally put some chain lube in those springs to keep those nice and quiet. I've heard those things chirp and squeak. And overall, a quiet bike is a happy bike. If everything is tight, well lubed, well maintained, when something does start to come loose or go wrong, it'll be a lot easier for you to notice it out on the trails right away, rather than having a big, loud, clapped out machine and you just can't tell if it's just life as usual or if there's something really serious you need to take a look at. All right, folks, thank you guys very much for coming along. I know we didn't go too much into shifting and tuning of the derailleurs. Again, we made a separate video and we will link that below, or you can click on it above. But again, this was kind of more of like rattles, loose, things coming apart, safety bolt checking and preventative tightening of things before they catastrophically fail on you out on the trail. Thank you guys again for watching. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions, if you have any noises of your own, please ask down below. We would be happy to get back to you and offer some help. Maybe even give us an idea for a future video. Thank you guys again. Please subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see you back for more videos in the future. Hope we'll see you out on the trails.